Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Jacob and Matthew, for the invitation to speak again. I've always loved coming here. Long celebrated in Finland as a foundational modernist, Helene Schjerfbeck is relatively unknown to the rest of the world. Today, her art is Finland's proudest legacy. Represented in public and private collections throughout the country and in Sweden, her extraordinary paintings have not yet earned the recognition they deserve. Schjerfbeck painted in her native Finland for nearly 80 years. Born in Helsinki in 1862, her working life encompassed a remarkable expanse of art history and geopolitical history, for that matter. She witnessed civil wars and world wars, and she finally fled Finland as World War II devastated the country. In portraits, interiors, landscapes, and still lifes, the exhibition traces Schjerfbeck's life as an artist, from studies in Paris atelier in the 1880s to her final days in Sweden, where a series of searing self-portraits documented her fragile decline. The Finnish Art Society is where Schjerfbeck got her start. Recognized at an early age for her exceptional talent, she was enrolled in the drawing school at the age of 11. Her teacher, the genre painter Adolf von Becker, urged his students to paint only what they could see in nature. Schjerfbeck was well on her way by the age of 18, conforming to the cultural and political groundswell to define a national identity against the oppression of Russian rule. Artists of note painted romanticized imagery drawn from Finnish history and literature. The exhibition's paintings highlight passages in the artist's oeuvre, from history subjects in a naturalist vein to greatly abstracted imagery in which her distinctive artistry, adding and subtracting layers of paint, took center stage. Living most of her life far from the nexus of modernist thinking and experimentation, Schjerfbeck evolved her own modernist language, not in response to contemporary trends in Europe, but rather in a self-directed capacity, working quietly, privately, and remotely. Government grants enabled Schjerfbeck to travel to Paris, where she joined an international community of expatriates, several close Finnish female artist friends among them. Paris offered a freer environment for women, affording Nordic women fewer social constraints than in their home countries. Years later, reflecting on those years in Paris, she wrote of her pleasures. "I still recall everything of my first years in Paris, even the apples on a shelf in Cézanne's locker, Sisley's delicate poplars, and the busy streets of Pizarro. From Daumier's drawings, one can see that even Van Gogh learned from others. After all, it is his vivacity that we see in those lines." In the 1880s, Paris was a magnet for young artists in training. Schjerfbeck joined a handful of Finnish female artists who called themselves the Painter Sisters. They were also self-styled as Sisters of the Brush. Living on modest government stipends, they studied together and shared accommodations. Schjerfbeck first joined her closest compatriots, Helena Westermark and Maria Wieck, at a small school for drawing and painting exclusively for women. Schjerfbeck trained in naturalism under the tutelage of prominent artists. She exhibited at the annual Paris Salon and traveled to Brittany and St. Ives in Cornwall to paint. It was in Concarneau, Brittany, that Schjerfbeck painted Clothes Drying, a scene without narrative that defied ready classification. When shown publicly in conservative Helsinki, the painting caused an uproar. Critics found it astonishing that the subject overtly abandoned canonical landscape painting. Writing in a local newspaper, one journalist said, "At first glance, you're almost dumbfounded by this painting, which lacks a single tree or bush to form a landscape, or anything else that might give it a feel of a painting." Recognizing the need for visibility in the public arena, Schjerfbeck spent the summer of 1882 in Helsinki, painting her most ambitiously scaled canvas to date, Fête Juif, Sukkot, Feast of the Tabernacles, with a plan to submit it to the Paris Salon. The title refers to the autumn festival of Sukkot in Judaic history, a memorial honoring the exodus of Jews from Egypt. Schjerfbeck may have been reflecting on her own childhood as she painted this intimate scene. As a child, she often walked past the Jewish cemetery in Helsinki with her mother, and she was later well aware of the increasing persecution of Jews across Europe. The painting was successfully admitted to the Salon in 1883, the first of her pictures to be so honored. Several years into her sojourn in Paris, Schjerfbeck was invited to join Austrian painter Marion Prendelsberger and her husband, the British landscapist Adrian Stokes, in St. Ives on the north coast of West Cornwall. She attended evening classes in Stokes' studio, and in St. Ives painted several foundational works of her early career, works investigating a more daring spatial language. Schjerfbeck returned to Finland in 1892 to teach at the Finnish Art Society's drawing school. She later trained students in the painting studio. It's said that she mentored many young artists who would go on to illustrious careers, and yet her students never really knew her. She always kept her distance and resisted answering questions. She demanded absolute silence in the classroom and moved about quietly. This is no surprise. Schjerfbeck was very private, preferring to express herself on canvas and in the many letters she wrote to friends. It's in writing that she shared her innermost thoughts. In one letter, she writes of her struggles. No artist has accomplished in any given day what they'd hoped for when they woke up in the morning. Each day deals a heavy blow. How can one tolerate this disappointment? Year after year, that struggle has taught me to love loneliness. And in another letter, mostly I just sit by myself. I feel lonely sometimes, and yet life feels pleasant. I don't care for company. The work keeps me upright, and the rest renews me from all the thinking, end quote. I should mention that Schjerfbeck suffered neurasthenia, an arcane word to describe depression, a condition that challenged her well-being and interrupted her painting right through life. It's actually remarkable that she had the tenacity and resilience to continue painting when her emotional circumstances often mitigated against it. In 1902, Schjerfbeck resigned her teaching position and moved with her mother to Hyvinkää, a small railroad town 57 kilometers northwest of Helsinki. It was customary practice in Finland to care for a widowed parent, and Schjerfbeck could survive on support from her mother's modest widow's pension. Their accommodations were Spartan and without climate control. Helene slept and worked in the only bedroom, and her mother lived in the kitchen. Winters were brutally cold, while summers were often unbearably hot. Helene would actually find a certain peace in Hyvinkää, removed from the critical eye of Helsinki and free to paint all day. It was in Hyvinkää that she largely evolved her own formal language. Working primarily in figuration, she often posed her mother and local residents in quiet interiors where her brushwork veered from simplified naturalism to evocative abstraction. As you can imagine, a railroad town with a woolen mill and sanatorium had no professional models. Shopkeepers, neighbors, and Olga Schjerfbeck posed for these charming pictures. It's said that Olga Schjerfbeck had little appreciation of her daughter's paintings, and yet as a captive candidate, she modeled repeatedly, reading or sewing for canvases manifesting a new aesthetic. In My Mother Reading, Schjerfbeck has stripped away vestiges of her early training, streamlining color and form in spare, unmodulated passages, all to foreground the sitter in profile. She shines a light on her subject, but offers no individuality, no persona. As the artist explained, we do not need to enumerate all the details. It is by mere hint that we approach the truth. In another picture where Olga modeled, marvelous light defines her receding hairline and arthritic hands as she struggles to sew a garment. Silence prevails once again. Olga is lost in thought, seemingly unaware of her daughter's easel. It is the quietude, or better said, disquiet, that Schjerfbeck imparts. She asked her subjects to sit quietly as she embarked on every picture. Once underway, she then told them to leave, preferring to rely on imagination and memory. These mature paintings abandoned the tight brushwork of her Paris training. Freely brushed and freed of props, they collectively introduce an atmosphere of silence, isolation, interiority. In 1907, a young neighbor, Anna Lintomäki, sat for a painting simply titled Silence. The bus-length study is one of the few one might call a portrait. Predictably, there's no contact between sitter and painter. Anna averts her eyes, staring downward, her presence bathed in a soft light. Anna Lintomäki sat with her sister Irene for girls' reading. Here, various drawing media, watercolor, gouache, and pencil combine on paper to realize a matte surface. The self-engaged young women resemble mannequins, remote, lifeless, and yet highly affecting. Once again, it's the raking light that animates the protagonists. You will note the teaser on the wall, Holbein's portrait of Erasmus. On the eve of World War I, Schjerfbeck embarked on the Tapestry, a picture that carried her earlier Hyvinkää investigations to another level of abstraction and modernity. Two ethereal figures appear to float in space against a flat background and an elevated ocean horizon line, recalling elements of Japanism. The image has a disquieting quality, its narrative eluding us all. There's some speculation that the painting was preliminary to a tapestry, or that the figures are standing in front of a tapestry. We know that Schjerfbeck designed tapestries at a moment in time, but there's no definitive explanation to account for this mesmerizing picture. Despite living a quiet life in Hyvinkää, caring for her ever-enfeebled mother, Schjerfbeck's visibility was growing. The art dealer Gösta Stenman discovered her work in an exhibition at a museum in Helsinki and immediately bought Girls' Reading, which you just saw. After opening an art gallery in Helsinki, he tracked down Schjerfbeck in Hyvinkää, paid her a visit, and left with 12 paintings. From that moment forward, he engineered her sales and became her devoted advisor. Helene was uncomfortable with her growing fame and rising market value. She only wanted enough cash to manage her practice. Her treasured privacy was fast disappearing. It was Gösta Stenman who introduced Schjerfbeck to literature, books and periodicals describing contemporary trends in art, above all in Paris. He even took paintings to Hyvinkää, works he was selling by Picasso, Juan Gris, Marie Laurencin, and others. While the isolation of life in a remote town had its advantages for a painter, especially one of Schjerfbeck's temperament, it was insular, and Stenman was eager to share news of the burgeoning international art scene. An artist who would have a profound impact was El Greco. He was one of many historical masters to capture Schjerfbeck's attention, even if her exposure was limited to black and white illustrations. Spanish Woman, after El Greco, clearly pays explicit homage to El Greco's Madonnas, as do other paintings of later years. Writing in 1932 to her lifelong friend, the artist Helene Westermark, she spoke passionately about her attraction to the artist. In Toledo, to Greco, I still yearn as before, and they have explained this to me. People are drawn to their kindred spirits. And I have read of El Greco that he paints the way aging painters do, without concerning himself with the results, but simply to express what he wanted to say. She adds, "What should we care for the results anymore, if in years to come someone should find our work on a scrap heap and see something in it? That's surely more than enough." In 1915, Stenman, her dealer, invited a handsome forester to visit Schjerfbeck in Hyvinkää. Einar Reuter would profoundly impact Schjerfbeck in her lifetime, and ever afterwards, for that matter. Their friendship grew intensively, fueled by a shared passion for art and literature. He collected her paintings, sent her books and French art magazines, and wrote her first biography. Above all else, Reuter was Schjerfbeck's confidant. 18 years her junior, she felt very deeply for him, ultimately writing nearly 1,000 letters to him over several decades. Since Swedish was her primary language, she was actually unable to read his Finnish language biography of her life and work. Long after she died, Reuter's biography was republished in Swedish. It may have been fortuitous that Schjerfbeck was spared Reuter's biography, for while he championed her art and clearly felt great affection for her, Reuter was the first to write of Schjerfbeck's cascading misfortunes. He mythologized her victimhood, exposing her fragile mental health, her low self-esteem, and struggle through life to develop her art to satisfaction. This undeserved legacy is slowly fading today as international audiences come to recognize her strengths, tenacity, and indomitable will. Exhibitions in European museums are multiplying. Schjerfbeck painted Einar on several occasions, here in formal dress and again in a sensual pose. She labored over the formal portrait, never quite satisfied. In the end, she dismissed it as a sketch. The sailor is another matter. Awkward and seemingly unfinished, it was painted in 1918 when Helene and Einar spent 2 weeks together in Tamassaari, a coastal village on the southern tip of Finland, overlooking the Baltic. Suspending the expectation of formal elements, the viewer must read the painting as an elegy to Einar. Each brushwork carried emotional weight. It was really a love poem. Elena had fun with her titles, often assigning misidentifications to her subjects. Reuter was no sailor. While teaching at the Finnish Art Society, Schjerfbeck was commissioned to travel to St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Florence to copy the great masters in their respective museums. She deftly painted transcriptions of Dutch 17th century artists, as well as the magisterial Velázquez, among many others. The Finnish Art Society's historical collection was nascent, and this plan to show copies of masterpieces from Europe's premier museums seemed a suitable short-term solution to their empty walls. Today, these paintings reside in the Atheneum, Finland's national museum in Helsinki. While in Florence, copying the frescoes of Fra Filippo Lippi and Fra Angelico, Schjerfbeck painted several dreamy views of Fiesole, the hill town overlooking the city, especially in the 1894 picture entitled Cypresses. Trees dissolve into weightless masses. Even the cypresses lose clarity in their statuesque formation. The artist is already loosening her brushwork, puzzling the eye, and leaving the precision of her French training behind. It may have been the aging, layered frescoes of Florence that first encouraged Schjerfbeck to experiment with her painting materials. She started scraping her canvas with a palette knife and stylus to expose underlayers of paint. Fragment, the profile study of a young red-headed girl who modeled for several pictures in Hyvinkää, is exemplary of the artist's growing fascination with her materials. Resembling a fragment of a deteriorated plaster surface, the painting achieves a quiet pathos reminiscent of Renaissance Madonnas. Schjerfbeck used a palette knife to scrape away medium, mimicking a passage of fresco worn over time. She wrote to Einar Reuter of her frustrations. The red-headed girl got so greasy and shiny from being overpainted so many times, I wanted to scrape it all off. But then I didn't have the nerve. I wanted to bury her in the ground to get rid of the shine, but I hadn't the nerve to do that either. I had no idea what the result would be, and I didn't dare paint on the background. It was better for it to stay that way. Cowardliness, fragment, end quote. Years later, Schjerfbeck searched for this piece to buy it back. She called it her most sensitive painting. The delicately crafted head set against the irregular textured ground is indeed very affecting. Schjerfbeck would focus on surface texture for the rest of her life. Her artistry was increasingly bound to the materiality of her work. This preoccupation with adding and subtracting layers of paint was central to her evolving modernist aesthetic. In 2022, anticipating our Schjerfbeck exhibition, the Met bought the Lace Shawl, a painting that clearly demonstrates the complex process by which the artist manipulates the surface textures of many of her pictures. Overall, the canvas surface is varied and complex. I shall take one passage in the painting, the shawl, to demonstrate the technical complexity. Schjerfbeck begins painting the shawl with a thin, dark underpainting. Once it was dry, she used a broad, flat blade to scrape vigorously through this paint layer, exposing the high points of the ground and canvas weave beneath. She used a pointed stylus to scratch the fine channels. She then brushed on dilute black paint to fill the channels and cover the scraped high points, creating a lacy effect. On the left side, she added pearly gray paint made with zinc white, later abrading that layer too, so that only traces remained. Then using wide brushes, she added layers of deepest black paint to lapel-like areas of the shawl. Finally, she added the calligraphic black and cream strokes in the left shoulder and scratched into the paint around the inner content of the shawl. I know these nuanced surfaces are hard to imagine while looking at a slide, so I urge you to come see the exhibition in our Lehman galleries. No other painting in the exhibition offers such a clear demonstration of the additive, subtractive technique central to Schjerfbeck's process, and she expected her paintings to retain that sense of process. Einar Reuter mentions the lace shawl in his biography of Schjerfbeck, noting that her subject, Sigrid Nyberg, as her subject, Sigrid Nyberg modeled, the light around her felt harsh, and yet it hadn't bothered Schjerfbeck. In her words, once again, even harsh can be beautiful, if only I can reach some beauty into it, so that the painting would have some balance. It can stay as a draft, too. Perfection always looks dead. As with the evolving aesthetic in figure painting, still life subjects run the gamut from pleasing impressionistic studies of flowers to arrangements of fruit that lose all sense of volume and geometry. Schjerfbeck painted the still life of apples and a vase of hydrangea entitled The Red Apples, One Winter in Hyvinkää. The sharpened light and high-keyed color emerge from reflections in the snow outside. Structurally, the artist is abstracting geometries, softening form, and merging objects in a haze of light. She is clearly experimenting with surface textures in this pulsating picture. Using both a palette knife and brushes, she varies the layers of paint and leaves passages roughly brushed as if to remind the viewer of her process. She once said of painting apples, "They're too beautiful to make a successful oil painting." Still life with blackening apples carries more weight than meets the eye. It was probably painted in Stockholm, where Schjerfbeck moved reluctantly in 1944 at the urging of her dealer, Gösta Stenman. Stenman feared for her safety in Finland as war raged on. In a palette varying from off-white to black, the painted apples devolve into anonymous interlocking shapes, having no volume nor visual affinity with their fruit. Once again, Schjerfbeck has manipulated her surfaces using dry pigment in varying degrees of application. The blackened apple is thought to be a metaphor for the devastation of war. The apple actually rotted while being painted, a further metaphor for the artist's own inexorable decline. She died 2 years later. If there is any through line in Schjerfbeck's remarkable career, it is her 40 self-portraits. From the youthful vigor of her early days to her growing confidence as a painter and increasing manipulation of her materials, to the final head studies, skeletons awaiting death, this corpus of material traces the artist's trajectory as an aging woman and evolving artist. We have 13 self-portraits in the exhibition. Many of the late self-portraits are still in private hands, passed from one generation to another with enduring reverence. The detailed chronology in our exhibition catalog demonstrates how consistently and widely Schjerfbeck's work was exhibited in the later decades of her life, building a lasting legacy in Nordic countries. Seeing Silence is the first major exhibition of her work in the United States. It is on view until April 5th. Looking intently at the viewer and herself in a mirror, the young artist is on the cusp of life's adventures and tragedies in this early self-portrait. Loosely brushed in naturalistic language, Schjerfbeck neutralizes her background and lightly touched bodice in gray-brown tones, while offering a sensitive self-awareness and youthful optimism in expression. She was living and studying in Paris when she painted this charming portrait. She has clearly mastered her intensive training. This portrait declares a self-image of increasing self-possession. It's prominently signed and dated. Schjerfbeck appears as if caught unaware, looking leftward with vibrant eyes. Her very pale, chalky white face, interrupted by dashes of gray or rose red, presents against a flat black torso and variegated background of sheer abstraction. 50 years old, the artist is now experimenting with image and color, favoring aesthetic expression over tradition-bound verisimilitude. The asymmetry of the eyes, one blackened iris and the other translucent blue, adds another idiosyncratic touch. Fellow Finnish artist Helene Schjerfbeck, Schjerfbeck's great friend, called the painting technique ruthless. In 1914, Schjerfbeck was commissioned to paint a self-portrait for the boardroom of the Finnish Art Society. It was a distinct honor, for she was the only woman invited, along with 14 prominent male artists. One of the artist's most celebrated paintings, this is the only self-portrait to interrupt the spare figure-ground relationship, here with a discreet paintbrush and red-rimmed tub. The signature above her head, evoking a gravestone epitaph, has led to the inference of mortality, but it's more likely a self-conscious device to declare her presence in the company of men lining the same walls. Referencing this painting, Schjerfbeck wrote tellingly of her process. "I scrape out everything I have done, for it's not what I want, and when I've scraped many times, what remains on the canvas is a hint of all I have sought for and wanted, even if it's only a weak trace, or else there is nothing. The result is the sum total of my search. That is how I always work." Schjerfbeck's increasingly stylized image reaches a climax in self-portrait with silver background. The rather formal handling is less a study of self than an investigation of materials, pencil, watercolor, and charcoal in combination with silver leaf. At face value, the iridescent silver leaf reflects the mirror from which the artist captured her image. Her kimono-like garment, barely defined in charcoal, pencil, and watercolor, situates the viewer relative to the mirror. We see the raised sleeve of her working arm. As with so many of Schjerfbeck's self-portraits, she gives few clues to her inner self. Her cool detachment and rather stiff definition are only interrupted by vibrant eyes that lock in the viewer with bemused intensity. Quote, "I've drawn from the mirror a melancholy eye in a large dark shadow," end quote. Schjerfbeck's words would seem to describe this abandoned self-portrait. Of course, it's the aggressive scratches incising the face that draw our attention. Was the artist expressing frustration or simply canceling the portrait? Whatever the motivation, she reversed the canvas and painted factory girls on the way to work, an image framed and shown on the walls of a Finnish museum for decades. It was only very recently that the scratched canvas on the reverse was discovered. Of course, there is an irony to her scratches, since scratching through layers of paint was customary in her practice and central to her painting process for most of her life. An angular jaw, almond eyes, pursed lips, and mask-like head pushing against the picture plane characterize self-portrait in black. She's 73 years old. The high-collared black dress carries no volume, only a dab of olive green paint, likely a brooch, centers the upper chest. Her facial distortions, seen increasingly in the late portraits, are at once disarming and arresting. She's found her tropes of self-expression. Faced with the ongoing devastations of World War II, as I mentioned, Gösta Stenman persuaded Schjerfbeck to leave Finland for a safer environment. She spent her last years in Stockholm yearning to return to her beloved country. It was there that she painted 20 of the now legendary self-portraits. They are among the most extraordinary portraits in modern times, and the market for them has never waned. In many of these, she worked in thin glazes of color, paint that soaked into the canvas as if a metaphor for the gradual dissolution of self towards death. Schjerfbeck has lost all facial idiosyncrasy. She is herself in paint, and at the same time, anyone on the eve of death. When I first saw this painting in storage at the National Museum in Helsinki, it took my breath away. Raw and cadaverous, her black socketed left eye is stunning, while the right side of her face loses all definition in deep shadow. The face of death, I wonder what the artist meant by the red dot. For someone who cherished her privacy in life, she painted pending death with raw candor. This image, painted a year before Schjerfbeck died, has been called her most brutal self-portrait. Instead of focusing on death and bodily deterioration, the skeletal face is metaphoric of anger. There's no resemblance to its human. The mouth and eyes are black sockets, the nose and single nostril, mere strokes of the brush. Schjerfbeck's working of the canvas is equally as brutal, even if this technique characterizes many of the artist's more peaceful paintings. As per the title, Schjerfbeck is structuring her face in death. What's left of it, in light and shadow. Only the proper left side of her face has definition. The unusual palette taken from the green tiles of her hotel bathroom in Stockholm in no way diminishes the force of the ghost-like head. Imagine that Schjerfbeck was in her 80s when she executed these extraordinary portraits. Schjerfbeck wrote to her dear friend Einar Reuter in November 1945, quote, "I have no strength left. Life has given me all it has to give," end quote. This resignation is captured in Schjerfbeck's final self-portrait in oil, her last painting in life. With features articulated, strangely manipulated ears, and a vacant expression, the artist truly has, quote, "no strength left," a face stilled and near death. Schjerfbeck died of cancer on January 23rd, 1946, with her easel at her side, having drawn her last self-portrait in charcoal only days earlier. Her ashes were brought back to Finland for burial. Laying flowers at her graveside, Einar Reuter said the following words: "You have now reached great peace. Your days were heavy, days and nights during the long years and decades, heavy from loneliness. Only in the brief moments of being able to create did that heavy path brighten up for you. In these moments, when you felt you were able to bring to reality something of the vision you see in your mind's eye, the people of Finland thank you for that brightest beauty you have given us." Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions.
Can we turn the lights on?
Yes.
Thanks. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll come see the exhibition. Her work does not reproduce well, especially her technique, her process. In fact, even the naked eye doesn't see the process very well. One needs a raking light on these paintings, and then it appears. What I didn't say is that our conservator, Charlotte Hale, did an extensive technical analysis of our painting, the lace shawl, and that is how I had such a detailed analysis in my talk. Yes?
The catalog looked excellent. I was there 2 hours ago. The catalog is very impressive.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Charlotte Hale, the conservator, wrote an essay for the catalog as well on our painting. Yes?
Should I go?
Oh, sorry, I'm not in sync with Ray Jacob.
Yeah, I know. Yes, the show, which I happened to catch Sunday, just because I had out-of-town guests who wanted to go to the Met, was amazing, and then topped off with this talk. But when you mentioned the little red
Yeah, do you have an idea of what she might be doing?
I wasn't going to ask this, but that kind of gave me permission to ask about the other big dot on the forehead, which is on the cover piece for the show. If you know anything about that one, or was it intentional, or?
I think it's just a reaffirmation that she's really thinking aesthetically rather than individualizing her figures or caring a bit about their, the loyalty to their own facial expression. I mean, that's a very general answer. I don't really know. I do know that that if you look at her paintings, you'll sometimes see a very a brushstroke of color, and it's often in the lips of the females. I mean, she did paint some portraits that were recognized as portraits, but not what I showed you. She painted 2 portraits of her brother, and she was very interested in fashion. She actually wrote to the Galerie Lafayette and bought patterns and made her own clothes. I mean, she was really living, in remote Finland. When I said to a Finn in the wandering around the exhibition that it was that Hyvinkää was 2.5 hours from Helsinki, they said, no, it's 20 minutes. I said, well, this was 1900. Yes.
Hey, Dita. The late paintings, it's a beautiful show, very moving. The late paintings are just beyond, I mean, they really do go beyond the human, and it's very powerful and stirring. I'm curious, she's showing and exhibiting all through her life. Were those exhibited during her life?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, they were only painted in the last year or 2 of her life in Stockholm. So, no, I don't know. I don't think so. But the paintings that she did when she was healthy in her lifetime were shown in exhibitions actually in Sweden and in Helsinki. And then when Gösta Stenman moved to Sweden, of course, he sold her paintings there, and that's why we've borrowed 5 or 6 from Sweden. But otherwise, she's not as well known in Denmark or Norway or the continent, for that matter. But the Atheneum, which is the Finnish Art Society's museum that is now the National Museum of Finland, is making a concerted effort to place exhibitions of Schjerfbeck's work all over Europe. She's had exhibitions in Paris, Hamburg, London. I think they're working on Vienna, and they're hoping for the Prado. So she's finally seeing some light. Our visitors have been so surprised to find an artist they didn't know, and have been very moved by the discovery process, which isn't something I could predict.
Hi. The self-portrait with the scratches through it on the back of the other painting. Could you speak a little more to the decision behind showing it and how it's shown too?
That was only rediscovered in the 1980s. The museum had I guess it must have had a backing board on it, and the museum only showed the factory girls. And I don't care. I was very careful in the selection of the exhibition. She made 2,000 paintings. We only show 56. And I didn't really care for that type of picture, those 2 factory girls, you remember. But there I am. Everyone at the museum said, no, you must show it as a double-sided painting. So, but it was difficult to get supplies in living regionally, away from the city. So it wasn't unusual to turn your canvas around.
Is much known about her personal life, either with men or women?
So there wasn't much of a personal life with men or women in terms of intimacy, but if she had any intimacy, it was with Einar Reuter. I think she was really deeply in love with him, actually. And 4 years after they met, he married a Swedish woman his age, and she had a nervous breakdown. So she was hospitalized a few times in her life. She was very, very upset to lose him. But, you know, he was always aware she was considerably older, and yet they remained friends. She continued to write to him. He wrote her biography, and he spoke at her grave. So it's a sad story, but that's as much as we know, and I think that's about all there was, actually, in terms of other. When she was in Paris, as I said, she went to Brittany and she went to St. Ives, and when she was in Brittany, she met an Englishman to whom she was engaged, and when he learned that her father had died of tuberculosis when she was very young, actually, he broke off the engagement because tuberculosis in those days was considered hereditary.
In the 40s or 50s, certainly 60s, there were treatments for depression. Is it known whether she received any type of
That I don't. I mean, she received care, you know, medical care in these sanatorium, but and they were in Finland. Her mother took her once, but she always rebounded. Her painting kept her alive, quite honestly. It was her oxygen.
Congratulations, Dita. It's a stunning show. She was obviously immune to the modernist currents in Paris when she was there. And then she seems to be inventing a homemade modernism.
Yeah.
What kind of contact with what was going on in contemporary art did she have? Did she see magazines? Did she see
So let me go back to Paris first. She did go to the Luxembourg Museum, which is where, you know, run by the government in those days, and where they showed contemporary art. And she said the paintings were ugly. That's been quoted somewhere. But she spent a lot of time at the Louvre, and, you know, she obviously was appreciating the Impressionists. What was the second half of your question? I'm sorry.
What did she
what
see?
did she have access to in Finland?
She traveled a lot, but it was, you know, to copy old master paintings.
Yeah. No, she never had access to, I mean, apart from of the few paintings that Gösta Stenman brought to her. I'm not sure what she thought of Juan Gris or Marie Laurencin, but they were clearly aware of her isolation. And I think she's all the more extraordinary for having produced what she did in such isolation. Yeah.
Let's do one last one.
Hello. I also saw the show on Sunday. It was really great. While seeing the show, I felt kind of like an overall sense of like sadness. And when you mentioned that, you know, kind of she struggled with loneliness and depression, I was wondering how much of that kind of carried or like influenced her paintings throughout her life. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, I think you see a lot of, the paintings are very quiet, the figure's remote, there's no eye contact with her. The male authors who've written on her until recently mythologized her victimhood, how she had so many challenges in life. She was frail, she fell down the stairs at the age of 4, injured her hip, she had a limp for the rest of her life. They went on in that vein. And I have wanted to redirect that conversation and look at her painting, although I've obviously leaned very heavily on her life because nobody knows anything about her, but I've wanted to really want visitors to think of her as a Nordic modernist, you know, as someone who, if you knew nothing about her personal life, you should appreciate this exhibition with as much vigor. But if you think about the isolation and the living with her mother, who was, I think, probably quite disagreeable, and she stayed with her till she died in 1923. And of course, I don't read Swedish or Finnish, so everything I read was, along with my research assistant, was in English or French. And the stories are very repetitive.
Thank you so much, Dita.
You're welcome.